My most significant discovery was not about mental illness. It concerned people who notice everything others overlook and why this ability often harms them. In my clinical work, I recorded cases of what I call differentiated perception. These were individuals who could read microexpressions, sense hidden emotions, and identify psychological patterns invisible to most people. They could see through social masks, detect lies immediately, and feel the unspoken tension present in any environment. I considered this discovery dangerous because such individuals consistently became isolated, exhausted, and unable to sustain ordinary relationships. Not because they were unstable, but because perceiving everything carried a psychological burden few could understand. The case that revealed this began with a patient I noted extensively in my private records, a strongly introverted, intuitive individual who came to me in 1913 during my own psychological struggles after separating from Freud. This patient, who would later represent what I classified as one of the rarest personality types, displayed what I called undifferentiated intuitive perception. She could enter a room and instantly sense its psychological climate. Who was lying? Who was distressed? Who held unspoken resentment? I wrote. The patient demonstrates an unusual ability to perceive unconscious material in others. Yet this talent brings her distress rather than benefit. She struggled with small talk because she saw through every social performance. She could not maintain friendships as others felt exposed in her presence. She had difficulty keeping employment because her awareness disrupted the unspoken psychological agreements that allow groups to function. I realized I was not treating a disorder. I was observing what happens when the unconscious becomes too conscious. When perception becomes so refined that it interferes with social adaptation. I recorded her describing people with astonishing precision. She spoke of others as though she had access to their private thoughts and concealed motives. When I confirmed her statements through careful questioning, they proved highly accurate. This was not delusion or psychosis. It was a level of consciousness so heightened that it became socially risky. But I soon encountered something even more concerning, because her extraordinary perception seemed beyond explanation. I began studying what I would later call participation mystique, the psychological state in which individuals with highly differentiated intuition become overwhelmed by unconscious material from others. In my notes from the Red Book period, I wrote, there are individuals whose psychic systems are so finely attuned that they absorb not only conscious communication, but the entire unconscious atmosphere surrounding them. I identified a specific pattern within my typology, the introverted intuitive type, a very small minority who not only feel intensely but perceive unconscious dynamics with striking clarity. I observed that these individuals possess what I termed a differentiated intuitive function. Their minds register not only obvious social signals, but also hidden emotional states, repressed material, and psychological patterns unseen by others. They can recognize the sadness behind forced smiles. They recognize the desperation hidden beneath confident behavior. They sense the collective shadow that groups silently agree to overlook. I explained that the danger does not lie in the perception itself, but in the psychological isolation it creates. When someone clearly sees what others cannot or refuse to see, they become a mirror society finds difficult to face. This leads to what I call the problem of the superior function, the point at which a person's greatest ability becomes their greatest burden because it separates them from participation in the collective unconscious. However, I found that the real threat was not the perception alone. People with highly refined perception can clearly recognize the unconscious material in others. As a result, they often become targets of what I extensively described as shadow projection, where individuals unconsciously attack the person who reflects what they cannot accept within themselves, in psychology of the unconscious. I wrote that nothing influences a person's environment, especially their children, more than the unlived life of the parent. But I later realized that this principle applies to all relationships. When someone's shadow is mirrored back by another's clear perception, the unconscious has two possible responses: integrate the shadow or attack the mirror. I observed this pattern repeatedly in my clinical work. The individual who sees clearly is often blamed for creating the problems they merely recognize. My patients with strong intuition experience this regularly. When they gently pointed out that someone seemed troubled, they would be accused of being negative or causing drama. When they expressed concern about obvious issues, they were labeled judgmental or accused of inventing problems that didn't exist. I realized this was not accidental, it was a psychological defense mechanism. In memories, dreams, reflections, I wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But for most people, it is much easier to reject the person reflecting their shadow than to examine what is being reflected. This dynamic creates what I call the scapegoat phenomenon. Highly perceptive people often become the assigned problem in every group they join, not because they create conflict, but because they reveal issues already present in the collective unconscious. I observed that the person with superior perception becomes the repository for everything the group cannot consciously admit about itself. This explains why such individuals do not just feel misunderstood, they feel systematically targeted by something they cannot logically describe. Yet my most unsettling finding was still ahead. I noticed that overwhelming perception expressed itself differently in various individuals. I identified 4 distinct patterns within the introverted intuitive type, each representing a unique way of processing the unconscious material of others. Type 1. The feeling intuitive. I studied patients who combined introverted intuition with a highly developed feeling function. These individuals do not simply notice what is happening psychologically. They experience it in their own bodies. They take in the emotions of others so deeply that they often can't separate their own feelings from the emotions they've unconsciously absorbed. I wrote, the feeling intuitive lives in a constant state of emotional contagion, carrying the unexpressed emotions of everyone around them. Type 1. The feeling intuitive. These individuals absorb emotional energy so fully that their internal world becomes blended with the emotions of others. Type 2. The thinking intuitive. These people recognize psychological patterns and predict behavioral outcomes with remarkable accuracy. I noticed they could foresee relationship breakdowns, career failures, and personal crises long before they happened, not through deliberate reasoning, but through unconscious pattern recognition. I observed that they have a rare ability to grasp logical outcomes of unconscious processes long before others can. Type 3. The sensation intuitive. I studied patients who could feel the physical expressions of psychological states in others, detecting illness before symptoms appeared, sensing fatigue before it was admitted, or noticing physical tension that revealed emotional strain. I wrote, these individuals act as early warning systems for psychological and physical conditions within their environment. Type 4. The pure intuitive, the rarest group 1, countered combined introverted intuition with what I described as an undifferentiated auxiliary function. They perceived everything but struggled to organize or clearly express what they sensed. I observed that they live in constant overwhelm, receiving large amounts of unconscious information without the mental structure needed to process it effectively. Understanding your specific pattern matters, because each type needs a different approach to what I called the integration challenge. But first, you must understand why I viewed this discovery as dangerous, because I witnessed the harmful effects of undifferentiated perception in my patients. I concluded that seeing too much without proper psychological integration posed real risks to both individuals and society. I identified 3 key dangers that made this discovery unsettling. Danger 1. Collective unconscious disruption, I wrote. The individual who perceives too clearly threatens the shared agreements that maintain social unity. When someone sees beyond the collective illusions that hold groups together, the silent agreements to overlook certain truths, they become a destabilizing presence. I observed that families, organizations, and societies rely partly on unconscious agreements about what will and will not be acknowledged. The highly perceptive person unintentionally breaks these agreements simply by being authentic. Danger 2. Psychological isolation. I documented how differentiated perception creates what I call the problem of superior function, when your greatest psychological strength turns into the source of your deepest suffering. I describe this as the curse of consciousness, the reality that awareness cannot be shared with those who do not possess it. The individual becomes an island of perception in a vast sea of unconsciousness. This isolation is not only social, but existential. Many people in this state often report feeling as though they are living in a completely different reality from those around them. Danger. 3. Identity dissolution. Most critically, I observed that individuals who take on unconscious material from others frequently lose touch with their own genuine personality. They become overwhelmed by external psychological content to the point that they can no longer separate their inner world from what they absorb from their surroundings. I refer to this as participation mystica condition, in which psychological boundaries fade, and the person becomes fused with collective unconscious elements. I wrote, the danger is not only social exclusion, but psychological destruction, the total loss of individual identity in favor of collective influence. This is why I viewed the integration of heightened perception as not just therapeutically important, but psychologically essential, because unintegrated heightened perception carried such risks. I developed what I called the individuation process, inorganized. It's a method for preserving personal identity while forming a conscious relationship with unconscious material. Phase 1. Recognition and differentiation. I taught my highly perceptive patients to first recognize when they were taking in psychological content that did not originate within them. I described this as conscious discrimination, the capacity to distinguish authentic inner experiences from unconsciously absorbed external ones. I wrote, the first task is to clarify what belongs to you and what belongs to others. Without this distinction, individual development cannot occur. To support this, I instructed patients to spend time in complete solitude each day, allowing absorbed material to settle so they could identify their true psychological voice. Phase 2. Shadow integration. I found that individuals who easily see the shadow qualities in others often do so because they have not yet acknowledged their own. The more you deny your potential for deception, selfishness, or cruelty, the more distressed you become when you see these traits in others. I wrote, everything that irritates us about others can lead us to a deeper understanding of ourselves if we are willing to look inward rather than staying focused outward. Shadow integration means accepting that you contain every human quality you notice in others. This does not make you a bad person, it makes you a whole person, capable of seeing clearly without judgment. Phase 3. Conscious participation. The final phase is what I described as conscious participation in the collective unconscious, the capacity to engage with the psychological material of others without becoming overwhelmed or losing one's sense of self. I explained that an individuated person can function as a bridge between the conscious and unconscious, helping others become aware of what lies hidden within them while still preserving their own psychological stability. To do this, one must develop what I termed psychological containers, the ability to temporarily hold another person's unconscious material while maintaining a clear awareness that it does not belong to you. Because I understood that heightened perception can either transform or destabilize a person. I examined historical figures to distinguish between successful integration and psychological collapse. Nietzsche, an example of unintegrated perception, was significantly influenced by Nietzsche's philosophy. Yet I also observed how his amplified perception contributed to his eventual psychological deterioration. In Memories, Dreams, Reflections, I described Nietzsche's ability to see through social, religious, and philosophical illusions with sharp clarity. However, I noted that he never learned how to integrate these insights in a constructive way, instead of using his perception as a tool for healing or understanding. He employed it as a weapon against society. I wrote that Nietzsche possessed remarkable insight into human nature, but he identified too strongly with his dominant psychological function rather than incorporating it into a balanced personality. His isolation and eventual collapse illustrated what occurs when superior perception remains unintegrated. The individual becomes consumed by their own insight rather than transformed through it. Meister Eckhart, a model of successful integration and contrast. I studied the medieval mystic Meister Eckhart as an example of someone who successfully integrated heightened perception. Eckhart embodied what I called mystical intuition, the capacity to perceive spiritual and psychological realities inaccessible to most people. Unlike Nietzsche, however, Eckhart directed his insights toward compassionate guidance. I wrote that Eckhart transformed his heightened perception into wisdom that nurtured others without overwhelming them. He saw deeply yet communicated in ways that encouraged understanding rather than resistance. Eckhart's success, I explained, stemmed from what I called conscious humility, the recognition that superior perception is a responsibility to be shared wisely, not a force to be imposed, my own integration process most importantly. I recorded my personal struggle with overpowering perception during what I termed my confrontation with the unconscious. From 1913 to 1919, documented in the Red Book, I wrote that I felt threatened by the possibility of psychosis and was saved only because I could understand my experiences through my work with patients. My heightened awareness of unconscious material, both my own and that of others, nearly overwhelmed me until I learned to integrate these experiences consciously. My breakthrough came when I realized that these intense perceptions were not pathological, but evolutionary. They signaled an effort by consciousness to progress beyond the limits imposed by the collective mindset. This realization reshaped how I approached patients with similar abilities. Because people with heightened perception often experience isolation, I stressed the essential importance of finding what I called the few who understand, those capable of engaging with a more developed consciousness without reacting defensively. In The Development of Personality, I wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Yet this privilege cannot unfold in solitude. It requires being seen by individuals who can recognize genuine authenticity. I outlined 3 essential types of relationships for highly perceptive individuals. Type 1. Fellow individuated persons. I explained that one individuated person can identify another immediately. There is a particular presence and authenticity that cannot be imitated. Such connections often arise quickly and with intensity. You recognize one another as members of what I called the conscious minority. These relationships are uncommon, but vital for psychological survival. With other individuated individuals, you can be fully yourself without worrying about overwhelming or unsettling them. Type 2. Those engaged in individuation. I observed that people actively involved in their own inner development through therapy, self-reflection, or spiritual practice can often handle heightened perception without reacting defensively. They may not possess such perception themselves, but they understand its importance. I wrote, those who have begun to know themselves can bear to be known by others. Type 3. Natural containers. One identified individuals who, although not possessing superior perception, have what I termed a natural container function, the ability to hold psychological material without becoming overwhelmed. These are often mature people who have endured significant life experiences. The recognition process. I established specific signs for identifying safe relationships. These individuals ask sincere questions about your observations rather than reacting with immediate defensiveness. They can acknowledge their own inconsistencies and limitations without shame. They display what I called psychological mindedness, an interest in inner life. They maintain emotional steadiness when confronted with difficult truths and show authentic curiosity about consciousness and growth, gradual revelation. Protocol. I taught a careful approach for sharing perceptive abilities. Begin with small, gentle observations. Notice how they respond to feedback. Assess whether their reaction is defensive or curious. Increase depth gradually. Based on their demonstrated capacity, always frame insights as contributions rather than declarations. I emphasize that the goal is not to find people who agree with everything you perceive, but to find those who can treat your insights as valuable perspectives rather than threats to their self-image. Integrated superior perception supports both personal and collective growth. I viewed successful individuation as necessary not only for personal health, but for the advancement of human consciousness in the undiscovered self. I wrote that the individual has always been the bearer of the living spirit, the one who initiates transformation in society. I believe that individuals who integrate superior perception become what I called culture carriers, people who support the evolution of consciousness. The 4 stages of transformation. Stage 1. Recognition without overwhelmed. First stage of transformation begins when you learn to acknowledge your perceptive abilities without becoming burdened by them. I referred to this as the conscious acceptance of one's superior function. I wrote that the beginning of wisdom is recognizing who you truly are, not who you wish to be or fear you might be. Stage 2. Integration. Without isolation, the second stage involves learning to use your perceptive strengths in a constructive way while still maintaining meaningful relationships. I called this social individuation, becoming genuinely yourself while staying connected to others. I noted that an individuated person does not retreat from the world, but interacts with it more intentionally. Stage 3. Service without sacrifice. Third transformation happens when your perceptive ability becomes a contribution rather than a personal weight. I describe this as conscious participation, using your strengths in service to others without exhausting yourself. I wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are, and then offering that authentic self in service to the whole. Stage 4. Legacy without attachment. Final stage involves what I termed the transcendent function, using your perception to support the evolution of collective consciousness without becoming attached to whether others acknowledge or accept your efforts. I noted that the individuated person works for the future, not for personal praise in the present. Integration becomes a form of cultural medicine. I believed that individuals who successfully integrate heightened perception play a significant evolutionary role. They recognize what collective consciousness has not yet seen, helping prepare humanity for essential developmental progress. I wrote, "What is not brought to consciousness appears in our lives' fate. Those who develop and integrate perceptive abilities help bring unconscious material into awareness before it surfaces destructively in collective behavior." Yet, I also warned about several pitfalls that can interrupt this process. Because integrating a superior function carries specific risks, I documented the most common ways individuals hinder their own development. Pitfall 1. The inflation trap. Wrote extensively about psychological inflation when individuals identify with their superior function rather than integrating it consciously. In my essays on analytical psychology, I warned that the danger occurs when the ego merges with the archetype, causing an inflated sense of self that disconnects a person from human relationships. Highly perceptive people often fall into what I called the prophet complex, believing they must rescue everyone from their unconscious state. This results in judgment, preaching, and eventual isolation. I observed that the moment someone believes they hold absolute truth, they become unconsciously possessed by the very forces they aim to understand. Pitfall 2. The withdrawal justification. Described cases where individuals use their perceptive abilities to justify complete withdrawal from society. They convince themselves that others were too unconscious to engage with what I recognized as spiritual superiority disguised as wisdom. Wrote that true individuation requires engagement with the unconscious world, not an escape from it. The hermit who withdraws from life has not transcended it, but been defeated by it. Pitfall 3. The helper's high. It's observed that some highly perceptive individuals become dependent on being needed. Their identity forms entirely around their ability to help or guide others, causing them to lose connection with their own inner development. I warned that when perception becomes identity, the individual disappears behind the function. This is the opposite of individuation. It is the sacrifice of the self to the role. Pitfall 4. The overwhelm return event. Individuals who have developed strong psychological integration can regress during times of stress, trauma, or major life changes. In such moments, they may lose their inner boundaries and become overwhelmed by the unconscious material of others. I emphasize that integration is never a fixed achievement. It is a dynamic, ongoing process that requires consistent awareness. To support this process, I outline several practices for maintaining integration. Spending regular time in solitude to separate your own inner material from what you absorb from others. Making conscious decisions about when and with whom to use perceptive abilities. And continuing shadow work to reduce the projection of personal, unconscious content. I also stress the value of connecting with people who can offer reality checking and support, as well as using creative expression to manage excessive perceptual input. I wrote that an integrated person does not reach perfection, but learns to work consciously with their own psychological complexity, understanding superior perception within the broader evolution of human consciousness. I saw highly perceptive individuals as serving an important developmental role. In the undiscovered self, I explained that the individual has always been the carrier of the living spirit, and the one who initiates transformation in society. I viewed those with heightened perception as consciousness pioneers, people whose psychological development progresses ahead of the collective. History repeatedly shows that such individuals often emerge before society is prepared to receive their insights. They function as early explorers of psychological territory that humanity will eventually need to understand. I wrote that what first appears in individuals as psychological insight later becomes a collective cultural shift. The individual becomes a testing ground for developments in consciousness that will ultimately help the wider community. Sensitive individuals often feel collective problems sooner and more intensely, and their personal struggles can mirror issues the culture must confront. A key idea I emphasized is that superior perception contributes most to human evolution. When it is integrated consciously rather than endured passively, the aim is not to become a martyr to consciousness, but to serve as a bridge between the present and what is emerging. I wrote that an individuated person supports the collective not by giving up their individuality, but by developing it so fully that it becomes a gift to others at its highest expression. Individuals with superior perception carry their abilities with ease. They see clearly without being overly attached to others, accept their perceptions, and understand deeply without feeling compelled to correct everything they notice. I referred to this as the transcendent function, the capacity to support the evolution of consciousness simply by embodying a more aware and balanced way of being. Remember my patient from 1913, the introverted intuitive who sought my help during my own psychological crisis? After 3 years of working through my individuation method, her life changed in profound ways. She learned to distinguish her own psychological material from what she unconsciously absorbed from others. She eventually found work as a counselor, where her refined perception allowed her to support people in distress. She formed relationships with individuals who valued her insights instead of feeling intimidated by them. Most importantly, she no longer experienced her heightened perception as a burden, but as what I described as a gift requiring conscious development. I documented her transformation. She learned not to see less, but to see with greater clarity. Not to perceive with less depth, but to engage more deliberately with what she noticed. Her abilities remained the same, yet her relationship to them became integrated rather than overwhelming. This reveals what I consider my most dangerous insight. Some individuals are born with a level of consciousness that surpasses what the collective is prepared to handle. Such advanced perception can either lead to isolation and emotional overload, or evolve them into exactly what humanity needs for its psychological progress. Your heightened perception is not a flaw in your psychological structure. It is an advanced stage of conscious development. You are not broken for noticing what others overlook. You are simply ahead of your psychological time. The real question is not whether you should suppress your awareness to match the collective unconscious. The question is whether you will develop the individuation skills needed to integrate your perception with intention. My individuation method offers a path from dangerous isolation to conscious contribution, from overwhelming awareness to integrated wisdom, from feeling cursed to becoming an evolutionary asset. You were born to perceive deeply, not to endure your insights in silence, but to use them in service of consciousness development. The world needs your perception, but it needs it expressed with the maturity, wisdom, and strategic understanding that turn intense awareness into cultural healing. Your gift itself is not the burden. Your unconscious relationship to it is. When you learn to integrate it deliberately, you become what I believed highly perceptive individuals are meant to be: pioneers of consciousness, preparing humanity for psychological growth that is approaching but not yet widely recognized. My most unsettling discovery wasn't simply that some people perceive everything, it was that many who do never learn to use their insights wisely. The real danger lies not in perception but in failing to develop a conscious relationship with extraordinary abilities. You are not too much for this world. You are precisely what the evolution of consciousness requires. Once you learn to use your perception with the same intention with which I learned to use mine, the danger of seeing everything is not that you see too much, it's that you may never learn to see with the integration and wisdom your gifts require.